So in this year, I want to discuss two entirely unrelated topics. First, we're going to discuss opinion related to Hilchos Nida that we're learning now. It will be a little shorter than a usual one. And then the second part, as I was more accustomed to do last year, to talk about other Inyanim, other Noisim, Inyan Diyayma. So we'll talk about something that has to do with the shofars of Rosh Hashanah. But to start with Simon Kuf Pedaled and Sif Aleph. Sif Aleph includes V'chol Isha Sheyesh Leveses Kavua Bo Aleha Shalei B'Shas Vesta Ve'en Tzricha B'Dika Lefnei Tashmish. Right, so that's that discussion. Libri Noikfei Avo Shalei B'Shas Tashmish Kol Amar B'Livdei Karezim Shabachas. The Sif says halacha is the more the better. This isn't the only place it says it in these halachas. It gets repeated again later on in Simon Kuf Tzadik Vav Sif Tes. Ha'isha Shamar B'Livdaik Bein B'mei Sfirasa Bein B'Yamim Shalei Rasa B'hem. So either Zayin Nekiyim or Yimei Tarasa. Arezim Ushabachas Alpha Pishi Yesh Leveses Kavua. It's great. It's encouraged, even if she has a Veses Kavua. And why should you even suspect anything? And the first marker, of course, is in the Mishnah and Nida in the beginning of Perek Beis. Kol Hayad Amarbe Livdik B'Nashim Meshubachas, and the Sefer U'Ba'Nashim Tikatzitz. So one of the young Galayit here in Kolel, here right now, asked me shtickle klotz kasha. That don't we teach everyone? Shukha touched on this briefly. Don't we teach everyone not to check more than necessary, more than required? Don't look and don't this, don't that. That's always the signon. That's the style in which everyone's taught. So how does that fit with this? And I think the way the question was asked was more in the direction of, we know you're not supposed to check. So vi steht in Shulchan Aruch. How could it be that? How could it possibly say what's pshat in Shulchan Aruch pasha? We know halacha l'maaseh not supposed to check. So. I got back to him, I answered him the kids about Pes, and I thought it's interesting Indian, so we're going to lay it out here a little more in detail. I just want to point out that in this case, more or less relying on different svarim that already were malaket. Some of the Makaitis, each sefer is malaket, a portion of the Makaitis, and I'm putting it all together in a certain way. Before we continue, I just want to point out that as we continue, just keep in mind that there's really four different situations, scenarios in which there's a discussion as to should we check, should we look, or should we not create problems. So number one is be made to harasa in general. That's what it was talking about here in Kuf Bei Dalet. Number two is Zayin Nekiyim. That also got mentioned in Kuf Tzadik Vav. Number three is if she finds a kasem and the kasem is a little questionable, should we check again now? And that way maybe we'll clarify what's going on. And number four, the bathroom. Looking at stuff in the bathroom. So just keep that in mind as we go through, just to keep track of the different cases. So as we shall see though, spoiler, turns out the idea of not looking, not checking, that's essentially, it's about 50, 60 years old. It's about how, that's the vintage, and, the pedigree of this idea goes back not very long, last couple of decades. And in fact, even as recently as pretty much this generation, you'll still find some of the Gdei HaPoskim still referring to the fact that, at least in principle, absolutely still true that Yad Hamar B'Livdik Mishabachas. So, for example, if you look in the Shiur Shevet HaLevi, here in Kuf Pedaled, he writes, among other things, and I'll quote more of it soon, but I'm extracting the following line: Yad Hamar Mishabachas Ena Kavan Livdik Atzmo Kol Shah Mamish. We're not saying to check every hour; that might be overdoing it a little bit. But Livdik Mipam Lapam Lahachzik Taharasa. Every once in a while, you want to strengthen the Tara. Maybe Melashon Chazaka, Chazaka of the Tara. We're praising because you're not taka required. So you do more than necessary. You're going beyond. But it sounds like he means practice, and this repeats itself a number of times there in the Shiur Shevet HaLevi. So if you want to know where did this idea come from, taka not to look. So ground zero, one of the important Makaitis is Taka Sefer Tara Kalacha, Farkash, Chelik Beis, Perach Gimel, which is about bedikos Lufnei Tashmish, Lachnei Tashmish, corresponds to some of what we're learning on page 580, 581. Farkash writes, even though it's explained in Mishnah and Shulchan Aruch, Shekol Isha Shamarba B'Bdikas, Shalei B'Shas Tashmish, Afi Meitar Asa, Harezim Mishabachas, but still, the Paiskim Shebizmanenu wrote that it's common for it to create complications as a result of checking. So therefore, you should not be machmer and add to the bedikos that you're required al pi halacha. And we'll get to, as we continue, we'll get to some of his makaitis that he mentions there. If you also look earlier in the Sefer, in Chelik Aleph, Perek Gimel, Ksamim, page 36, Farkash writes, she finds a kesem, Allah livdei, kol kanech atzma, exclamation mark. Don't try to investigate, because the kasem itself is midrabanan, so there are different possibilities to be matar if you bring a Torah off. The second she does a bedika, so even if it's the smallest drop, she's matame, and even if she has a tzliya to be toiling something, but the heter is a lot more difficult and has a lot of conditions, a lot of restrictions. Since she has no chiyuv to check, she should not do this in order not to make things complicated. He sends you to the ha'ara. And the Ari writes, "Upashatu v'chein moeden kol moede ha'hayrois hayuduim li." This is what everyone paskins the poskim that I know. And he adds, "See Shiur Shevet Alevi Simon Kuf Tzadik, who writes, Nira de'ein lazeh makar." The idea that if you have a kesem, you should then go double check. So even though there maybe was some achron who wrote that, the Shiur Shevet Alevi says, "Nira de'ein lazeh makar ve'ein chiyav livdik." And fakert, in such a case, the poskim should have said, that's very important to know, whether in Ksamim you should immediately check or not, and it doesn't seem to have been spelled out by anyone important along the way, so the Shiur Shevet Alevi does say that. However, the Shiur Shevet Alevi doesn't go fully along with Rabbi Farkash here. So Farkash says, L'daitoi, when it's nicker, that it's dam mamish, but it's only tar because it's less than a gris. So then the Shiur Shevet Alevi continues and says, really, it doesn't say anywhere to check here either. Toiv shetiv de gatzma. The Shiur Shevet Alevi says, if it looks like real dam, it's just less than a gris, toiv shetiv de gatzma. So he's quoting this, he's acknowledging, Farkash is acknowledging that the Shevet Alevi says this. He responds and says, tzarech bir. Why? Because ultimately, it's close to certain, if Farkash says, that she will find something and now she'll be tmeya. And if Chazal made a statement and said that ksamim that are less than a gris are tohar, even though they knew that chances are, when Chazal said that, they should have known that if you go and double check and do a formal bedika, odds are it will be tmeya. Alpha bikain, even though that's the reality, Chazal said, pachas migris is tohar. We have this taina, how will the poskim lefadish, right? Why didn't the poskim say this? And we didn't see any of the poskim say this, so I don't know where the Shevet Alevi is coming from. So that's how Rabbi Farkash responds to the Shevet Alevi. So we see that in the case of Ksamim, the Shevet Alevi is, in addition to what we said earlier, that it seems like he also holds B'chlal, we made Tarasa, but also in the case of Ksamim, the Shevet Alevi is machmer to check, and the Tarak Halacha is screaming, no, you're going to just create problems. And the case where the Torah says it's fine, you're going to go and do the other. Chazal knew, as we said. Now, for the fact that the Shevet Alevi didn't seem to think of this, so it seems that checking is when you have a shaila and isurim, you're not sure, maybe this, maybe that. So what's the way to find? You check, and that's how you find out. Right? You would think, without getting into ish, you would think, whenever there's a shaila of Yisurim, it's probably kedai to investigate and clarify things, why be left with maybe yes, maybe not. That would seem to be the instinctive approach to Yisurim. So the more you can check and be certain and not rely on shittis is probably better, even if it's not a chiyuv. And that seemingly is very logical, very instinctive to Yirei Shemayim. Now, you could make a distinction and say, when it comes to kashrus, maybe it's easier to be machmer in kashrus. You can just eat something else, or spend a little more money, and the product will be a little more expensive to make sure that it's on a higher standard. Mashenke in taras isha labayla, it's much more complex, and it's a different dynamic. So one assumes that Rabbi Farkash is coming from this direction. He seems upset about the possibility of preventing a husband and wife. Maybe you can compare it, if you're looking for a comparison, maybe you can compare it a little bit to the concept of hefsed meruben kashrus. When it's a hefsed meruben kashrus, then we treat it differently. Right? And these are all actually very broad topics, kashrus in general, and then we're going to get back in a bit to another kind of comparison between the two topics. But anyway, at any rate, just to try to explain where the Shiur Levi is coming from, if you can find an Isser and be safe from the Isser, that's great. And if you can not find it, then you're 100% certain that there's no problem. So that's where each one is coming from. Now, let's take a look at what Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote. There's a Tshuva in Igros Moshe about this. One of the early Mekaydos, like I said, last 50, 60 years or so. So in Igros Moshe, Chelik Ches, which is already one of the volumes printed after he passed away. For those keeping score in the Yeshiva Shavelt, they treat as the volumes go on. So Chelik Zayin's he was already a little incapacitated. He was still alive. Chelik Ches is already after, and Chelik Tes is even after that. And not everyone gives the same regard to each volume.
But he wrote all the letters.
But the question is, who's the editor, who's putting it out? And Shulchan himself found certain shuvas, the certain volume of Igros Moshe, maybe Chelik Ches Taka, was printed in Eretz Yisrael and printed in America, and there's a big shinoi in one of the shuvas, the text of one of the shuvas, Mamash Yush Nafkamin and Halacha. So there's the behind the scenes, the story of how to regard the editing of the Igros Moshe. But that's just a disclaimer, but it's in Chelik Ches, Yeridei Daled Simon Yud Zayin. Rav Moshe is writing to one of his Talmidim, and Rav Moshe says that even during the Zayin Akiyim, even during the Shiva Akiyim, there's no need for a woman when she's using the bathroom. There's no need to use a white, to treat it almost like a potential bedika. There's no need to look at it, because all you need, it's enough that you follow what you're required to do, the chiyuvim. So the Rabbi says, this is not just if you read Pshat in the Mishnah doesn't sound like it was talking about sitting in the bathroom. And then he starts giving the vart. What's the vart of Rav Moshe? He says, even if we're going to answer her, and he's going to get back to this, but he interrupts himself for a second, and he says, it's mistaber that the Maila B'chlal of Kol HaMarba, right, the Mishnah doesn't say necessarily clearly, or at least not explicitly, when it's talking about, mistaber that it's B'mei Tara. When it comes to Shiva Nekiyim, which is what Rav Moshe was coming from on this, since she has Chiyuvei Bedika, there's actually parameters. The Torah said, this is what you should do. So it doesn't make sense to say that you should do more than what you're already supposed to be doing. L'chatchilat, pamayim in a day, one in the morning, one next to the evening. Then the question is, b'diavad, how many you can get away with? This is from the Rambam also, when the Rambam brings, called Isha Shamar Belivdik Atzma, Isha Sheyesh Lavesas, B'mei Tarasa. So from different Mekaydos, doesn't sound like Moshe is interrupting himself to say. It doesn't look like many of the Mekaydos that it's talking about Shiva Nekiyim anyway, because Shiva Nekiyim, the Torah already tells you what to do. But getting back to his point, he says, B'chol Eif, and the whole Eif to what are you accomplishing when you have a bedika? When it comes to, you can say, for kashrus, for Yisurim, what are you trying to accomplish by checking? Before you checked, you didn't know, you had some doubt, you had a lack of clarity. Now you're checking in order to clarify. He says, if the checking is only going to create more questions and create sveikas, then you're not accomplishing anything. And that's even according to the Torah Mechaber, who wrote clearly, what Ramesh said a second ago is essentially against what it says in Shulchan Aruch. In Shulchan Aruch it said, Af b'mei sfirasa amar belivdik meshubachas. So just to keep in mind, Ramesh was almost got away with suggesting the hapach of the Shulchan Aruch. He's saying even clearly the kavanah throughout Mishnah, Gemara, Shulchan Aruch meant that you're clarifying, you're confirming. Bisman Hazeh, Ramesh says, we're not Baki and Maris. And he says, Ramachmer even Kamara Hashava Vazov. We'll get to the Maris and we'll learn about the different colors. Machmer, not Machmer. Because we're Machmer to the extreme. So that means chances are what she's going to find in a kinuach in the bathroom is not going to necessarily be clear cut at all. It's going to be iffy, and we're just going to be machmer because that's what we do now. So it'll be misafik or mechumra ba'alma. So that's not what the Mishnah and Shulchan Aruch are talking about. So that is why. So that's here's already like a halachic lumdish argument why it's not kedai to check in this type of situation. Right, so you're only trying to confirm something, find this or find the mutter, but not if it's just creating confusion. Another point that's mentioned in Svarim today is that, and Rabbi Shuchad mentioned it, that women today, their bodies are more sensitive, and the checking itself is just going to create the problem that wasn't there before. So, for example, if you take a look at an art scroll in Pischei Halacha, Rabbi Forrest, on page 135. So you have the chapter on bedikos, why, when, and how. So in section 4, bedikos, when and whether, so this is what it says here. There are specific circumstances when a bedikah is required, otherwise bedikos are not done. Although Chazal commend a woman who does additional bedikos, contemporary Rabbanim generally discourage unnecessary bedikos. The possible reasons for this are, A, since the woman is not required to do a bedikah, there is no reason to go beyond halachic requirements and cause unnecessary nidus. A woman should rather try to preserve her Tara status. And in the footnote, they write, even Chazal in their time were loath to cause unnecessary separation between man and wife. In modern times, when immodesty is rampant and life is full of anxieties and tensions, separation between man and wife causes additional stress and strain in their relationship. Perhaps in our times, Chazal would not have recommended additional bedikos. Okay. So that's reason A. And B, excessive bedikos commonly cause an irritation in the vagina, which in turn may cause blood to appear on the cloth. This blood is not uterine blood and should not cause her to become a nida. However, since we cannot be certain that it is not from the uterus, if she does a bedikos, she'll be considered nida, perhaps unnecessarily. And the Mitzvah in the bottom, to Pesach Shar, who was one of the contemporary Svarim on these Inyanim, you notice that it's common today that excessive bedikos causes irritation to that area. Therefore, a woman should not do bedikos unless required to do so. See also Igros Moshe, which it's that Igros Moshe that we just discussed. So that gives you an idea of the direction this halacha has taken in the last few decades for these ideas that have been mentioned. Back to the bathroom, which was mentioned by the Igros Moshe. So in the Sefer Chukas Atara, which we added to the library here in the Kolel by Rabbi Olbaum, he mentions you do a das for Rabbi Yashiv, and Rabbi Yashiv held that you should again, examples of Peskim today. Rabbi Yashiv held that she should check in every kinuach in the bathroom if there's dam, except in the first days after Tvilah, the loy mistaber shetira b'am dam. He gives a small window after going to the mikvah, but otherwise, check all the time. That was what Rabbi Yashiv. You do a das for Rabbi Yashiv. I guess it's not, maybe he didn't write it, maybe he didn't put it in writing in any of his official svarim, but you do it. That is something that even the Shevet HaLevi disagrees with, and the Shevet HaLevi, it comes up a few times here in the Sefer. So, for example, right here, right here in this Seif, on the words Kol Amar B'Luv D'Karizim Shabachas. So Vosner says Yesh Harbe Nashim Shegorma Yisrael La'atzmam, that they're checking the toilet paper after using the bathroom. V'nevea me'atzovim, it's coming from nervin, it's not coming from. Usually when we say nervin, it's to distinguish from kite, and it's unnecessary. That's a real bedikah. At least you're actually doing a bedikah. The paper over here, the toilet paper has a lot of chesreinas. Right? Because if you're actually doing a bedikah, you should use the cloth, not the paper. So this doesn't even count as a bedikah at all. So don't get into trouble where there isn't even a suffix. Of course, if she did happen to wipe and see, so then you have to ask, of course. Then we get to that quote that I quoted before. Yad Amar, but doesn't mean every shah, like going to the bathroom, but from time to time, lahachzik taharasa, and it's more than opi halacha. And really, when it comes to muberes and aminekas, you don't have this din. But bismanenu, this gets a little bit into this question about muberes and minika, which you learned about weiter. Nowadays, we know aminekas often does see. So then maybe it is mishabachas. So he's getting back to the Shevet Levi being pro bedikos, at least in theory. So he says it might even be recommended for menakas nowadays. And again, throughout the Sefer in a few places, he comes back to this. Again, in Simon Kuf Tzadik Aleph, in the Tzricha Livdik, it says in the Mishnah, Kol Yad HaMarba, Achar HaTolas Meraglayim, Ein Chiyuv B'dika Klal, V'af Ein Chumra, to look, V'rak Goydim Kulkulim, and the paper B'chlal, as we know, like you mentioned before, the Mara itself isn't clear. And Meraglayim itself has all kinds of maras. So this is something, and he repeats it a third time, also in Simon Kuf Tzadik Vav Taka, that it's not talking about this. Kalkelas Atzma, Machmas Atzovim, the same theme, repeated a few times. If you look in that Sefer Chukas Atara that I just mentioned, he's mitzayin to a Sefer Chaykus Man, who says that the Debret Sinner Shlita told him that his father, who we usually mean when we say the Debret Sinner, used to tell the women not to look at what they wipe, and that Shehu Atzmei Shlita, the son, the Debret Sinner today, goes further and says they should leave the light off when they go. That way there's no chance, because sometimes it's hard not to look. You tell you not to look, so you want to look. Turn off the light. And that way, clearly, I'm assuming he's speaking from experience, and that's how far he's gone with that. And he also told me, the author writes, that the guy in the Ramesha Naishlos of New Square used to also demand of the women not to look at it. So these are all very recent Makaitis, but just gives you a clearer picture of the development of this idea and the sources for that. Now, there is something that goes back a little further, and that is from the Alter Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek. In Charles Shuvas Tzemach Tzedek, Yeridei Siman Kufnun Beis, and it's also copied and pasted in Chedushi Tzemach Tzedek Anida on the Mishnah of Yad HaMarva. So the Tzemach Tzedek begins by summarizing the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Yishayim, the Frei Tashmish, the Achat Tashmish. But then the Tzemach Tzedek gets to the point that he wants to get to, which is, he says, even though it says Kol Yad HaMarba, Kol Zois L'f'amim Toiv Yoser Shetemayit B'vdikas. Sometimes, even the Tzemach Tzedek says, better to do less. What are we talking about? He says, this is K'mei Shekasav Rabbeinu, the Alter Rebbe, and the Tshuva, it's printed, Durei Shulchas Nida, about a woman, Shemoitza B'chol Yoim Al Ha'ed, Karten Ktanim. Karten, Kroten, however you want to pronounce it. I think etymologically it's actually related to the word carats when you measure diamonds, 24 carat. So in halacha, the Kroten ended up in this sugya. So you find these small things. So this is a din that's relevant to Siman Kuf Peches. If blood comes from the woman, whether it's wet, whether it's dry, Tameya, and even if it's in shapes, klippus, sidus, Tameya, but you have to test it. You have to see if they're able to melt by being soaked in lukewarm water for 24 hours, exact heat, what the level of heat should be. And if it's so tough that it still doesn't melt in that period of time, then she's tahira. Then it mentions also scratching with a finger, that doesn't count for anything. So she has this problem. She's seeing these pieces on the aid. She's checking every day, and she's finding these every day. And this is a problem. So the Alter Rebbe paskin that if they did a bedika, they checked, and they were able to determine that it's coming b'chlal from the Makoy Meraglayim, then you can retire them even though they melt and and they turn into blood. And then the Tzemach Tzedek says, the Alter Rebbe concluded, l'chatchila, we should warn her, shaloi laharbis b'vdikas kol kach midayim. Now on, please stop being finding every day. If you don't look every day, you won't find every day. If your mamish have a hargasha, which goes into that, but if she feels a hargasha, or samach levesta, lefnei tashmish, lo yacher kach, that's what the Alter Rebbe wrote. So the Tzemach Tzedek is trying to explain. So it says, even though Amar because it is a meshubach, because you might find blood, it's not good. But here she's finding these kartan, and she's finding them always. So what are we going to have to do? We're going to come to our Rav and say, we have a problem here. She's never able to become tar. What's the Rav going to do? The Rav is going to give a heter, a kula. He's going to be matar the mara. So what are your choices here? Either don't look, you won't have a shaila, or look, and you'll have a shaila, and you'll get a heter. So if this outcome is the same, might as well, as Tzemach Tzedek says, it's easier to be matar without looking. Why do we have to then look and then come up with a heter? If there's a suffix similar lines, if there was a suffix and now the bedikos is going to be pushed the suffix, lots of midday suffix, that's good. But here, yotzas chara be'efseida, because we're just going to have to be materet. Ramesh's vart was a little different. Ramesh's vart was we're going to have to taka aseret, but you're not accomplishing anything by asering when you don't know you don't know maris. Here, the Tzemach Tzedek is saying you're going to have to be materet. So what's the point? And now the Tzemach Tzedek brings a very interesting comparison to Hilchos Treifus. I'm a foolish Shosefin Shulchan Aruch and Hilchos Treifus. I don't know if anyone here learned Hilchos Treifus, but in Siman Lamed Gimel, the Ramah says in Sif Tes. So I'll quote the whole Sif, talking there about a koitz and the veshet. So thorns. We're talking about birds. So if there's a thorn in the veshet, the food pipe of the birds, so whether it's la'arkoi or l'rachboi, it's in there. It's not it didn't pierce it, ksheda. But if it's inserted, if it's stuck inside, then asura, even if you don't see scar tissue, you don't see a kairet dam, because we think we're chayshish, maybe the taka was a hole and then it healed and we don't see it. That's mechamer. The Ramah says, yesh machshirin, even if it's inserted, if you don't see a kairet dam, we don't have the chash. And then the Ramah continues and says, where we are, by uns in Stadt, we have the geese, the stuffed geese for the fat. That was common back in Stet, in the Shtetlach. So there's a takana to check. Really, there's a takana to check for a hole in the veshet because it's more common than even a sircha. But if they see that there's kites in the veshet, if they don't see holes on both sides, they don't see a kait adam, they're noig lahakal. The Ramah says this is not so good. This is not so simple. It's an isur d'oraisa. And the Ramah says v'yoyser hayatoyv shaloi livde klal v'lismei charuba milivde kolahakal b'makom d'ikareisa. It would be better not to check the veshet at all, which wasn't necessarily, there was a takana to check, but not for the takana, it's not the halacha to check. And then you're just relying on the roiv. Roiv birds don't have this problem. Masha'enken, if you check, and then there's a reisa, meaning there's something that it doesn't look like an isser, but it looks like something might be wrong. Now you're already being makel. You're going against maybe the ideal psak. So you see that Ramah also says this. The Shach there says that the Ramah didn't really mean it that way. The Ramah really meant that they should stop doing what they're doing. That they shouldn't eat these. They shouldn't eat these geese. He's just expressing himself in a certain way. That's what the Shach says. So the Tzemach Tzedek says, fine. That's in that case, because really it is a problem. But in this case, over there, really they should be checking and be answering. In this case, you don't need to check at all. It's only a shavach uzehirus. We can apply the Ramah's idea, at least over here, that when you have a reason that you have to be makel anyway, then it's better not to check, because there's no reisa to begin with. So better not to check. Now, just a Maimer Muskar, I just want to mention that this idea actually has very practical ramifications nowadays. Nowadays, in the field of kashrus with chickens, so there's a huge shaila about tzeimis hagidin. There's some kind of, somewhere in the leg of the chicken, there's a bunch of sinews come together, and apparently chickens today tend to have some kind of infection in that area, and it creates halachic shilas. So this has been an issue for the last bunch of decades, and it's still with us. It's still you read the Haredi headlines every now and then. The Tzemis Hagidin thing pops up again. Oh, the Eda Haredis is not being nizzer, and the Tzemis Hagidin. There's always news about it. So there's a big tshuva about this in the Shevet HaLevi, and a lot of the tshuva is around this whole shaila of when are you supposed to check, and when is it just better to not check and assume that everything is fine. This is from Tav Shalom Test, as Talmud Ramesha Shal Klein. So when I get this Shiur, so he says, you already broke down for me that there's three categories. Sometimes you see that there's an infection there. The most the person would realize it seems to be a problem. That seems pretty clear. You have to check. But Rav Trefus, number two, Rav Trefus and Semes Agidim is that someone who's not an expert would never notice that there's anything amiss. Only the mumchim would notice. And number three, sometimes Mamish can't tell us anything there. Even the mumchim wouldn't really know. But if you really invest, meaning when we say a mumcha, we just mean a mumcha looking at it. The shaykh checking it, he notices something. Sometimes the shaykh himself doesn't notice that anything's amiss. But if you literally took every single chicken to the laboratory to be checked, you would find that even some of those have a problem. So now the shayla is, what is the din chiv bediko when it comes to these things? So Shayla Levi says, of course, if there's actual infection, then obviously you have to check. And we're bucky enough to be able to figure that out. And that's not in the category of miyot. That doesn't even go into the discussion of miyot hashchiach. If there's a miyot hashchiach, do I have to check or not? This is a din reyesef. If there's a reyesef, there's something that looks wrong, and then you have to check. The shayla is when there isn't a reyesef per se. The question is whether we should go looking for it. Whether the mumcha would notice, or whether even the mumcha himself would notice. That is the shayla of miyot hashchiach. And that's an issue that comes up throughout Trefus, checking the Reya, checking the Veshet, checking the Daken. These are the sugyas in checking in Shchita. So Shevet Levi says that there's a big machlekes on this between the Beis Ephraim and the Mishkanas Yaakov. Now, for those who are a little bit familiar with Erevin, the Beis Ephraim and the Mishkanas Yaakov are a famous pair of Balei Plukta around the time of, I guess you could say, the Mittler Rebbe. The Beis Ephraim was from Poland, the Mishkanas Yaakov was from Lita, and their big argument was about Rishus HaRabim Bizmanenu, which most of the machlekes in the Erev usually tend to revolve around. And they were the first, you could say, the first modern example of this argument, where the Beis Ephraim said, of course, you need Shishim Riba, otherwise you're fine. And the Mishkanas Yaakov was being machmer, Lita, he's being machmer, that you don't need Shishim Riba, and part of it, and it's been going on since then, is counting how many Rishonim say what. Each one had a different count, a different cheshbon of who has more Rishonim on their side. So this all started with that machlekes. And they say that the Rosh Yeshiva of Lakewood used to, when Erevin used to come up in modern day questions here in New York, so he used to scream, the Mishkanas Yaakov, the Mishkanas Yaakov, that was his taina. And some even say that he said that I'm an anical of the Mishkanas Yaakov's brother, the Kerenaira, so a mamish personal. Everyone else is not an anical of the Kerenaira. Okay. Anyway, so that's the famous vikuach of those two. But they also have a vikuach, and people say that you can see that it actually kind of represents the different attitudes, especially a culture clash between how Polish psak worked and how Litvish psak worked. Anyway, so they also have an argument about this. The Beis Ephraim says there's three rules, there's three levels, and the Shevet Levi wants to summarize, he wants to sum it up. He says that when the miyat hamatzoi is mamish trefus, there's always going to be 1%, 2% of mamish trefus, not safek trefus, then there's a chiyuv bedika meikar hadin. That's why we're checking the reya, because we know that there's always a certain percentage that are treif in the lungs. Number two, there's a miyot hamatzoi of reises, and that's an example. That's like the geese that are stuffed. So that's already the next level. The reise is common, not the treifa. Sometimes you see the reise, but upon further investigation, it's not a problem. So in that case, according to the Beis Ephraim, it's kadosh atzmecha b'muterlach. And that's why the Ramah wrote, "V'toiv hayayiser shalei live the cloud, v'lismech harabam and live the klahakol v'makim diikareya." So that's why he takes the Ramah at face value. And the Ramah, why did the Ramah say that? Because the whole issue here is only a reis. Even when you find the kites there, doesn't actually tell you what happened. You don't actually know what happened. It's a chash. So because it's only a reis, so if that's the situation, toiv hayayiser shalei live the, who asked you to check? So you see this rishos, not to check. And then the third category of the Beis Ephraim is a cheskas iser. We're not going to get into that. The Mishkanas Yaakov disagrees and responded and said that even in a case of a safek iser, like the Ramah is talking about, there is a chiyuv bedika in a miyat hamatzoi meikar hadin. And he says the Ramah didn't. He holds like the Shach apparently that the Ramah didn't really mean it. Ramah was just expressing himself in a certain way. And Avada, of course, that's just the Rabbi Miyutai. They're most saying, okay, I can't change everybody, so I guess don't look. But the real din is, they're relying on din da'iraisa, as linen basar ruba, even b'miyut hamatzui. But b'payamamash halach al-maisa, if there's a miyut hamatzui of reis, according to the Mishnah's Yaakov's understanding of the Ramah and the Shach, you have to check. So that's the Shevet HaLevi's summary of that discussion. The Shevet HaLevi, further on in this discussion, when he's talking about what to do here, so he's saying that the problem is you have a bit of a problem here. When there's an infection, that's one story. But then there's the case of there's not an infection. We do have mumchen, we don't have mumchen, we are buck, we're not buck. He's getting into this discussion. But he says, Ruben Kekulam are not bucky. So he says, okay, maybe we could compare this taka to the Ramah of better not to check, because if we're not Bekiyam, we don't even know what we're looking for, we don't even know what we're doing here with the Tzemes HaGidden. So if that's the situation, if we're not Einon Nekroim Bekiyam B'zeh, so then what's the point of checking? What are you going to do then after you check? So maybe that's what the Ramah is talking about, a case like that. But if you have a Baki, if you have someone who knows exactly what he's doing, so then you do have to check. That's how the Shevet HaLevi is navigating this question. So that's just interesting to point out how this ties into halacha today. Back to the Tzemach Tzedek. So that was the part of the Tzemach Tzedek that was Negeya. I just thought we'll just finish off by quoting a bit of the Hamshach of the Tzemach Tzedek, because it is related to other dinim we learned, like Meinekas, and how to use that as a kula, also Zivas Davarlach, and things like that. So in this Shaila, though, the Tzemach Tzedek was talking about a woman who's a Meinika, who can't be Matar because she's finding Kartna on the Eid Bedika, and then they're melting afterwards. So we can't be Mekel here. She shouldn't check herself at all while she's a Meinekas, because it's Shchiach that she is finding. So in this case, not to look would be Kamaylim Ayin Mino Isser. This is much worse than the cases of Chafis. But we have an issue of Igun over here. So the Tzemach Tzedek says, I came up with this idea that maybe we could be Mekel, that it's still not, even if it melts, it's still not an Isser Vadai. And he gets into that, why it's not an Isser Vadai, because it's related to Simkuf Peches. So therefore, even here, he wants to say we can be Mekel, not to check we made Tarasa. But it's Sarachiyam, because Tzemach Tzedek says she feels, she should have to check. We know the derech hanoshim hamachmiros, the women that are taking things a little too seriously, once you set them on this track of hagasha, so then they keep on feeling it, or they keep on thinking they're feeling it. So if we're in trouble, you can't say don't check then there's a chiyuv to check. But we said she's a Meinika. A Meinika, according to halacha, really has a din of Misulekas Damim. So we use that. Then he says another vart. The Yehuda mentioned this idea of, this came up in we discussed the Asher Chanan, and Asher Chanan wanted to say that a kinuach could count as a hafsek tara. It comes from these types of tshuvas. So the Yehuda says sometimes a kinuach is good enough, like a bedika, and even though you can't rely on that against Shulchan Aruch and Yishainim, but in this case, because she's a Meinekas, because she has a cheskas mislekas damim, so even if she feels zivas davralach, so it's not a full chiyuv bedika, so she should just do a kinuach and say, if it would have been there, would have come up on the kinuach, and that's it. So it's just interesting to see how the Tzemach Tzedek is navigating the din Meinekas, the din zivas davralach, the din the kinuach instead of a bedika. Even though Stama Meinekas, you can't be making like this, you have to do a Bedika Gemura, but in this case, because of the Igun, you're going to calculate her husband, Yesh Lahakal, and that's all we made to Arasa. But Shiva Nekiyim, then she has to do real Bedikas. Okay. And in fact, Tarak Halacha, just to conclude this portion, the Tarak Halacha, he's talking about sign to the Tzemach Tzedek. However, if you look there, he doesn't really spell out what Tzemach Tzedek is about. He also doesn't tell you that the Tzemach Tzedek is not talking about all women. In the Pneim, he writes, you shouldn't check. And then the bottom says, and there's also the Alter Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek. So it's just important to clarify. When you look it up, it was about a very, very, very specific case. And the concept of not checking at all as a rule for a woman, as I said, apparently, mostly, there's one other tshuva, like an interesting tshuva, I'm not going to get into it, where someone, 200 years ago or so, they came to a city where the Rav told the women to stop checking so much. But and even he says he's not going to go against the Rav that came before him, but as a general well-known psak, this is the last few decades, as we said, You could also see a few other Makaitis there cited their entire halacha. I think this gives you the overall picture of this discussion and is illustrative of how some of these halachas work. To move on briefly to another topic related to Rosh Hashanah. So we know the Mishnah says mitzvahs hayom b'shofar. But if you look in the psukim don't really say much about what the shofar entails. All it says is Yom Teruah Yilachem. That's the extent of what the Torah really says, and it's left to Chazal to teach us all the details, all the pratim. Now, when it comes to the actual shofar, we have two mishnayos, and at first blush, the two mishnayos don't seem to shtim. You have Rosh Hashanah Perek Beis Mishnah Beis. It says Kol HaShofar is ksherin chutz mishel para. I think maybe this is the more famous mishnah. I think Cheder, everything besides the para is good. So it sounds like you have a big range, a big variety of shofars. Mishnah Gimel, it says, shofar shel Rosh Hashanah shel Yael pashut. Has to be of a Yael dafka. And other times we use shel scharim. Before I continue, I just want to, what's a Yael? Today it's also a popular name. So the Yael, the general, there's a discussion about this, but the general is generally identified as the animal known as the ibex. The ibex is from the goat family, and it's famous for walking up almost straight cliffs. It's able to jump from rock to rock, and all the pictures you see of them, it's always it's on the side of a mountain, on top of a mountain. And in fact, this is mentioned a few times in Tanakh, in Barchi Nafshi, we say, Harem Hagvayhim La Ye'elim. Also, when Shaul was running after Dovid, it says that it was a real intense search, and he was searching for him al pnei tzurei hayelim. So it's some kind of dramatic search where they're climbing over the rocks of the Yael. It's not the typical paved road. And also in Eiv, when Hashem is answering Eiv, and Hashem is saying, "Do you know what I know? Can you compare yourself to me?" So Hashem says, "Hayadata eis ledes yale salah." Do you know when the Yal gives birth? And what's the big if to of that? So there's a Gemara that says that the Yaela is achzoris al baneha. That when it needs to give birth, I know we know today other species when they have to give birth, maybe they have to go somewhere else. The Gemara says the Yael, when it wants to give birth, it stays on top of the mountain. The way the Gemara says it is that it's on purpose. The mother wouldn't mind if the baby just tanzed and fell off the cliff. So what happens? The Gemara says Hashem sends a nesher, and the nesher swoops by at just the right moment, and it catches it in its wings and puts it down safely. And if the eagle flew by the moment before, a minute after, the whole operation would be a failure. And Hashem has it all timed down to the moment. So you think I got Eiv mixed up? You think I got this right and I got Eiv wrong? Anyway, so that's that pasuk. So the Mishnah says Rosh Hashanah is Yoel Pashut, the ibex, which is more of a straight horn, not perfectly straight, but it's straighter. And other times when you need a shofar, it's Scharim Kfufim. What are Scharim? Scharim are the rams that we're familiar with in the regular sheep family, and the ram's horn is very much a spiral, and the Yael shofar in comparison to that is Pshuta. But later on, Rabbi disagrees with the Tanakhama, and he says the opposite. Rosh Hashanah toikim b'shol scharim, and the other times is with Yael. So if you look at the Gemara, it seems like we're paskening like Rabbi Yehuda l'gaber Rosh Hashanah. And in fact, elsewhere in Gemara Rosh Hashanah, it says more like an agadat lama toikim Rosh Hashanah b'shol ayil. Why do we talk to use a ram? So that comes once you have that psak, so you can say, that's the B'maskeh the Akedah. But then the Gemara wants to explain the machlekes between the Tanoim. So the Gemara says, Mar Savar Rosh Hashanah Kama the Kayif Inish Daititfe Mali. On Rosh Hashanah, the more you're kafuf, the more you're kayif, your das, that's better. And the other one held that Rosh Hashanah Kama the Pashut Inish Daititfe Mali. That you want your das to be more pashut. What does that mean? So you look at Rashi, you could tell from Rashi has a slightly different gersa. Rashi writes, not das, the person himself. The more a person's bent, it's looking down, that's better. He mentions it connects it to the Akedah. for tefillah and for kedus yitzchak. So that's why you need kfufin. The other opinion says kama de pasha tvei adif for karet nisel v'avenu al kapayim. Somehow you're supposed to be upright. So Rosh Hashanah is pshutin, and that's the idea. It's pretty clear that Rashi has a different gersa here in the Gemara, by the way. In fact, in the Ksav Yad Minchen, there's the famous Munich manuscript of the Gemara. You can look it up online. There's a website that has all the Kisv Yad of Gemara. You can see it says in the Gemara itself, Mar Savar Kamet Kayef Inish Tvei Adif, Mar Savar Kamet Posh Inish Tvei Adif, not Daite. And not Rosh Hashanah either. Rashi isn't necessarily referring specifically to Rosh Hashanah. So Maskana, the halacha, Rosh Hashanah, we're supposed to use the very curvy shofars of the ram. Tzad, the min ha'ayil is reminding us of the Akedah. And the tzura, the kfufim, is reminding us that a person, kaya finished, to look down in your tefillah, as Rashi explains. Now, back to the two Mishnayos. The two Mishnayos don't seem to be properly aligned here. First we said kol shofars ksherin, and then we said shel scharim kfufim. So there are two approaches we find in Rishonim and Halacha. Rav Rishonim and Paiskim said that both are true, but there's lechatchila and there's b'diavad, or there's mitzvah and there's mitzvah and a muvchar. So typical of this, you can find out Rebbe and Shulchan Aruch, Rosh Hashanah, Siman Tafkuf Peivav, Shofar shel Rosh Hashanah, mitzvah shehi yekafuf, k'shi yichpefu es libam, HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'tefillah. So not actually more like the Gersa in the Gemara, that you're being mekayf your lev. And kol ha-shofars hakfufim, the Alter Rebbe is being marked that all shofars that are kfufim are kosher except the para. Mitzvah min ha-muvchar is shofar shel ayil, but if you don't have a shofar shel ayil, you could use other minim. And even b'pashut, if you don't have a kafuf is only lechatchila, but b'diavad b'pashut yatsa. So that's how the Alter Rebbe puts all these pieces together. So there's mitzvah stam b'shofar kafuf of any animal, it sounds like. Mitzvah min ha-muvchar is of an ayil, b'diavad a shofar pashut. But if you look in the Rambam goes in an entirely different track. Hilchos shofar, paragraph aleph. Shofar shetaken by Rosh Hashanah, ukeren hakvasim hakafuf, v'chol ha-shofars chutz mikeren hakaves psulin. Ram literally says the opposite of the Lashon HaMishnah, kol ha-shofars psulin. The Ravid right there responds, v'charifus hifriz al midaisav. What's the Ram talking about? Mitzvah b'kfufim, v'mtaka b'shal yayil yatsa. But there are other Rishonim, there's a minority of Rishonim that also like the Rambam. We're not getting into all of that in too great detail. It's just what we need to continue. So it's interesting to point out that when it comes to this, halacha l'maisa, there are two quote-unquote scandals, controversies that relate, over the generations, that relate to shofars that are not from an ayil. The first one was about 600 years ago in Germany, and it's documented. It's a special letter that's survived. One of the Gedolei Ashkenaz at the time, his name was Rabbi Yom Tov Lipman Milhuisen. He's most famous for his sefer called Sefer HaNitzachon, which is a systematic takedown of Christianity. He was one of the Rishonim that put a lot of effort and energy into that. And even if the sefer is not necessarily, you don't hear about it in yeshiva, but apparently, at least at the time, at least the Christians, it actually made a tremendous mark. And there's an author who writes about him about 100 years ago, and this is how that author describes it. He says, from the day that book was published until close to this generation, which is the 1800s, the Reb Lipman is like the monster to every Christian who engages in interfaith debate. And for many, many days, years, if you wanted to graduate in theology, you had to, one of the steps was you had to write a refutation of Reb Lipman's book. That was part of the requirements to become a scholar of Hebraics or theology. To the extent that this became its own category, it was known in European languages as anti-Lipmania. That became a whole genre. Anyway, that's just totally derech hagav. He was one of the Gedolei Hadar in other areas as well, in the more mainstream areas, and we'll see right now something halacha l'maisa. So this letter was printed for the first time in the 1860s in some publication, and lately it was printed nicely in Yidush Haseinu and in Yeshurun. So it starts off by getting into these Makaidas about the Shofar Shel Ayil, the Machlekes of Rishonim, and he's emphasizing the Rishonim, those who hold that your taka only yaitza with an ayil, and that even b'diavad, if all you have is a goat, mi yachnis reisha b'zeh, that's how he's gearing up here. That who would want to even get involved to use another shofar when the Rambam holds that it's mamish, bittul mitzvah, chil yomtiv, bracha levatala. You don't want to mess with that. And then he comes and he exposes the scandal. What's the scandal? So he says, "V'hine oisa mitzvah kemat chas v'sholom nisbatla b'chol medinas Ashkenaz." The whole mitzvah of shofar has not been fulfilled in the whole Germany, the Germanic lands. Why? What happened? So it's already 40 years that there's been none of the Yidden in Germany knew how to make a shofar. It's not so simple. You get the horn, and then what do you do with it? How do you actually turn it into a shofar? So there was one guy who lived in Erfurt in Germany. He was the shofar guy for the whole Germany. And in fact, after him, his son took his place. And they were the ones who did all the shofars. And the whole Germany, they call the Aretz Bo Heino, to get, until they spread across the whole Germany. And then he says, a certain Talmud, depending on the Kisvayad, different names. One of them says, Reb Kellen of Ulm. Finally, someone taught himself how to make shofars himself. And then that's when the secret was discovered. All of a sudden, there was someone who could check the guy's work. And they discovered the horrible secret that all the shofars until now were all made from goats and not from rams. What was happening? Everyone, they would shech the ram, they would bring the horn to the guy to fix it. The guy would say, okay, see you later. And then the guy didn't know how to make shofars from rams. It's too curvy, I guess. So he would throw that in the garbage, and he would take a goat's horn and process it. And by the time you got it back, you didn't know the difference. It looked unrecognizable. So he uses the pasuk from Yaakov, the goats are replacing the sheep. And this was finally admitted to by the son, Uman Goy ben Uman Harishon. And they finally admitted that they've never ever in history ever made a shofar, shum shofar me'ayil. So Lippman says, when I heard this, charati charad gedayla, and the whole land of Ashkenaz, Karen Yisrael, play on words, has fallen, and we haven't done the mitzvah of shofar ka'alacha, and that's not a siman bracha because it says in Rosh Hashanah, Rabbi Yitzchak, kol shana she'ein teiken bo b'tchilasa. Meri and lo b'seifa. If you don't blow the shofar properly in the beginning, Streitman showing you're already Meri and you're screaming at the end. So maybe that explains why life in Germany has been so awful for all these years. And you finally figured out why. So I was mechazik that Reb Kellen HaKoyen of Ulma. I was mechazik Yad HaKoyen. He's a Koyen, Verdatious in this Malachas mitzvah, and he finally showed me. I watched before my eyes how he took a ram's horn, and we didn't let it out of our sight, and Itaka was able to turn it into a shofar. And now I was so happy we made him Keren Yisrael, to use a Keren Shalayel. And now we've already trained more Umanim Yehudim, so now we can totally fix this pirza, this terrible, unfortunate situation here in Germany. And it continues, and now he's making a gzeira and a isser, shelo yasa shum adam shofar she'eina shel ayil. We have to totally eradicate now these goat shofars, and Sai making it and Sai using it. There's a gzeira and an isser against anyone who uses it. As long as you actually have an alternative, the ikka shalayel, even if it looks inferior, you should use the shalayel. And he promises that anybody who wants to learn how, we're going to have a special training program. Whoever wants to learn exactly how to do it, come, I'll teach him. And the Umnim in the city have promised they're willing to help anyone who's interested. And if you send me the horn yourself in the mail, I'll take care of it. I'll send it back to you for a good price. And he says, by the way, a tip that if you're in your local city and you want to find someone who can do it for you, so call oisa blistrais. Anyone who's in the weapons field of work, they should have the skills. They should have what it takes to actually do the shofar as well. Beis hadchak. And he asked other Rabbanim to join him. And Tak in the Ksav Yad, there's another paragraph after that letter. There's another Rav that says, Chil b'Refraim, being mitzdaref to the Dovid Maharal. He was the Maharal before the Maharal was Maharal. And he adds, Homnick Mispashet Shavach Lakel should take him Mishlayel. There's in this article in Yerusha Seinu, which goes to a lot of these Makaidas, it mentions also the Maharil, that the Maharil sent specially to pull it up right here, but Maharil sent Hoya Marach Tzibura Matzrich Tziburi Kahal Magensa L'Shloach Tzir Meyuchad Achar Sheifa Shel Ayil L'Taka to Erfurt. And there was a story where the Shliach didn't even make it back in time. And he rolled in Smamish Mil Rosh Hashanah, and the Maharil used it, a whole drama. So we see, interestingly, how difficult it was back then. But what is a more recent manifestation of this? So, this before I go get into this, I just want to mention, at the time when I was looking into the subject, so around that time, on Rosh Hashanah, I met someone who had this big, large Yemenite shofar, and he was saying how someone gave it to him as a gift. It's a nice piece, and he thought, oh, let me take it on Mivtzoyim, because it looks a lot more interesting. It's an attraction. And you stop, instead of harassing people on the street, maybe people actually will be intrigued by such a beautiful piece. So it was ironic that this person was telling me this in light of the following, right? So we know the Yemenite shofars are very long and not kafuf like this, but twisty. They don't look at all like a ram's horn that we're familiar with. So the question was, when the Yemenites, the last 100 and something or so years, when the Yemenites started coming more in contact, moving to Eretz Yisrael and things like that, so the question was, wait a second, what is this horn? Where's this horn from? Is it possible, or is it at least not Shal Ayil, and maybe it's at least Ma'akev B'Diavad according to the Rambam, and don't the Yemenites, aren't they supposed to be following the Rambam? And there was this huge confusion. Some were saying this, some were saying that. It essentially seemed like the Yemenites themselves didn't really know where these shofars were coming from. The Yemenites themselves, they had the Yemenite shofars. They didn't know what animal, what species it's from. In fact, there were some, even as recently, maybe the last 50 years ago, we're still trying to claim that, no, this taka, there's a species of sheep. You don't know about it, but there's a species of sheep that grows horns that look like this. But, and it seems the reason for this is that these animals, as it turns out, it's basically been proven, people investigated and concluded that these shofars, especially the way they look, they come from the kudu. The kudu is a kind of antelope. It roams in Africa, and it seems like they're not native to Yemen, so someone was importing them over the centuries from northeast Africa to Yemen. It was distant enough that they weren't familiar with the species itself, just the horns. And a kudu, of course, is not min ha'ayil at all. Antelopes are their own category. I'd say they're closer to the deer, if anything, I suppose. So for that reason, once that was clarified, so you shouldn't be using them, because even if you don't go as far as Yom Tov Lukman Milhazen and say that it's a bracha v'tol this and that, but certainly the chatchila, according to everyone, you're supposed to use shofar shel ayil.
Are there any questions that say that Chachil can use
some of the Yemenite, not as kudu. Some Yemenite paiskim just feel partial to their messiahs, and they're more liberal in their take on it. They'll just say that our minhag, our messiahs. Certainly, we always had the ability to give other talib. We didn't have the option. We always could have had other shares if we wanted, and clearly this is somehow good and okay. I have a bunch of articles about these topics if anyone's interested to read in greater detail. That all is about, and that's all about just about the behemoth, which animal it is, which species it is. And that's not even getting to the shaila of the tzura of the shofar, right? So at least most of the time in Yemen, there's a certain amount of, it looks a little kafuf, although the question is, what does kafuf mean, right? And even in Ashkenaz, right, the shofar at least is, half a circle. But Rav Kapach, who was from Yemen, but not the kind who was into necessarily preserving this kind of Masada, the kind who was into debunking it, he has his argument. He takes it to an extreme. He says that the shofar shel yoel, the yoel itself is pretty curvy. It's a semicircle. And the Mishnah is distinguishing and saying, shel yoel kafuf, shel scharim kvufim. So he says, if you take the ram and then you chop off half of it and you straighten out the other half, and it looks like this, so vas is toif katan. You have the shel ayil, but it's might as well be shel yoel because it looks like that. This kafuf means dafka a spiral. I saw someone quote him, Rabbi Nevanzel, who responds and says, steht dann in Gemara that on Rosh Hashanah you have to be in a spiral? It doesn't say you have to be in a spiral. It says you have to be kayef. So kayef sounds like just a little bit bent, like the way a person looks when he's bent over. And what's pashut? And some people want to say that it's not the ibex, that it's referring to the oryx. The oryx has mamish very straight horns. You could make a shofar from that as well, so maybe that would be one way of entering. But it's interesting that Rav Kapach took this to a very great extreme, and he says anyone who makes a shofar and straightens it out, you're missing the entire point. Clearly, most people don't seem to agree with that too much, and kafuf, however much kafuf it is, but if it's not completely straight, that would seem to be a bit of a problem. Now, that I was mentioning, the kfufim and the ayin. I said I have a bunch of articles about that. Just to conclude, a minute or two. Interestingly, there's an additional hemshech. Then in Chassidus Chabad, there's an interesting emphasis on the Mishnah that says "Shel Yol Pashut." You open look at the Torah, the end of Hatam Nitzavim. So he quotes in Baruch Nafshi, "Zel Harim Hagvayim LaYaelim." That the Harim Hagvayim are nimshach lamata through Yaelim. And what are the Yaelim? The Kolel shofar. Why? Because shofar Rosh Hashanah Shel Yol Pashut. And what's that? That's tshuva me'emek halev. What does Yael mean? Yael means aliyah. You're being mile yourself to the darga of Ava, Shalomailam, and Adas. And what's Pashut? Yael Pashut. That Koma the Pashut libi Tfeyadif. You're being Pashut the Ava from its Islabshus and the Guf to just focus on the Eibishter. So a whole Hemshech, look at the Torah, going with Shefesh Rosh Hashanah Yael Pashut. So there's a letter from the Rabbi, from Bereisha, the Shat, the Tafshin Ches, Rabbi Yankel Lando of Bnei Brak. The Rabbi writes, "The Messiah with the Harim Yonah Diyamed," and the end of this mimer he quotes it. And the Chayr is Hepech Psak Din, the Shevesh Rosh Hashanah is Shel Elim. See also a different mimer, the Dibra Mas Yom Rosh Hashanah that explains Tak Shevesh Shel Ayil. We want Kfufim, come with the Kafif, not come with the Pashat. However, according to Rav Paiskim, at least it's kosher b'diavad, and according to the Rambam, it's b'diavad pasul. The Rebbe is touching on all this very bekitzer, but pointing out this interesting phenomenon in the mimer. And from then on, this turned, I believe the first time the Rebbe mentions this, and from then on, the Rebbe turned this into an illustration of the fact that Chassidus sometimes goes with things that are not lafi the halacha. So, for example, there's a letter, Thomas Tafshedan from Nissen to Lushkin, a famous question, the Torah says that an Isha is table the Tarasa and Mayim Chaim. But we don't pass on that halacha, you need Mayim Chaim. We just changed our mikvayos in the last 100 years or so, and now they're not Mayim Chaim anymore. So the Rebbe writes to listen to Lushkin, B'inei Muvin, this is, I think, quoted in the Taras Mayim, B'inei Muvin, that Lekut Torah is not a sefer Piskei Dinim, and sometimes Nistar the Torah doesn't always just have to explain the halacha, but also other days, Israel Divikim Chaim, for example, Lekut Torah Nitzavim, Shevesh Rosh Hashanah Sheyol Pashut. So there you go. That's how the Rebbe started using it. And you'll find this a lot in letters and Gutasuchas, but interestingly, as time went on, when the Rebbe wrote that letter, that was the only mucker that was printed. As time went on, and they printed more Chassidus and more of the Rebbeim, it turned out that there are other places of Chassidus where Chassidus brings both to explain both sides. So, for example, in Eira Torah, the Tzemach Tzedek and Dvarim Chelik Vav, Dunamas Yom Rosh Hashanah. So the Tzemach Tzedek says, "V'zel Amru." That Chadam Ayal Pasha, Mad Pasha Inish Daite Tfei, one to the opposite. Pasha Inish Daite is to be mispashed from the Levushim Hamastidim, like the world is a yesh, and to reach Yichud Eilah, Kula Kamekla, Kula Mamish. That's the Amas Lamitai. And that's Pasha Daite. You're being patient your das to get out of the Levushim and to be master the real thing. Chadamar called by the Kayef finish. That's talking about. He's talking about Kayef is lashon eskafia. That's Yichud Tata. If you can't reach the darga of Yichud Elas, Yichud Tata, so you've been Kayef finish, and then you have a constant struggle. Your Elam Haza is a struggle for you, but you're overcoming it. And in this manner, the Tzemach Tzedek is Masberit. We have many other places. The Marash, then the Fidik Rebbe in a bunch of places brings both, and I think in different ways. Tafresh Peitas, Tzadik Aleph, Tzadik Gimel, Tzadik Ches, Tzadik Tes, Tafshin Vav, and the Rebbe himself started mentioning it. There's a mimer from Tafshin Yutas where the Rebbe brings the way there Marash says it in Lamed Aleph. There's a mimer Muga from Tafshin Mem that takes from the Fidik Rebbe, and Tak and Tafshin Chav Zayin. When the Rebbe in Shabbos Chol Hamoed Sukkos Tafshin Chav Zayin, when the Rebbe mentioned this Lekut Torah as an example of something that's not halacha, At this point, the Rebbe already said that by the Finnig Rebbe, we find how the Finnig Rebbe actually does explain both sides. So that's just an interesting postscript, how this ties into how the Indian of Tekiyah Shofar is explained in Teres Chabad. Conclusion, I'd like to wish you all, Ksiv Chsima Teva, Shana Teva Masuka, Good Ben Shiur, Shraga.
Shofar is like a very